Good evening, everyone. My name is Sean Wilson. I'm the Artistic Director of the Ottawa International Writers' Festival, and I'm broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. I'm so thrilled to welcome you all to our 2021 fall season and tonight's conversation between Paul Wells and Jody Wilson Raybould. I want to begin by thanking you all for supporting authors and booksellers through these difficult times. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street, and I know that wherever you are right now, there's an independent bookseller nearby who would be more than happy to sell you some great books. In addition to Perfect Books, I should mention that copies of Jody's book are also available from Books on Beechwood, Octopus, and Singing Pebble here in Ottawa, as well as Mill Street Books in Almont, Librairie Clio in Pontclair, Quebec, Books & Co. in Picton, King's College Co-op Bookstore in Halifax, Westminster Books, Fredericton, New Brunswick, Tidewater Books in Sackville, Bookmark in Halifax, and Bookmark in Charlottetown, PEI. Support your independent booksellers wherever you are. They're good people, they pay taxes, and they make the world a better place.
Okay.
I also want to thank the Ottawa Public
Can you hear
Library,
me, Jody?
the Government of Canada,
I can hear
the Government
you.
of Ontario, the City of Ottawa,
Okay.
the Ontario
The problem
Arts
is,
Council,
we may be
Canada Council
we
for
may
the
be
Arts,
walking all over
Carleton
Sean.
University,
Neither of us
and
can hear
CBC
Sean
for their
right now.
ongoing support.
No.
We've got
Maybe
lots
So-
of great
Keep
events
back in.
coming up. Friday's podcast features Zoe Woodall and Alison McLeod. And next week we'll be hosting Mona Awad, Katerina Vermette, and Kamal Al-Soleil. So there's lots to look forward to. The festival is supported by generous individuals like you, so I hope you'll consider subscribing to our newsletter and making a donation to support our ongoing programming and children's literacy initiatives. We can't do this without you. Our host tonight is Paul Wells. Paul is senior editor at Maclean's magazine and has spent more than 25 years in the Hill, covering 9 federal elections and a big piece of Canada's history. His best-selling book on Stephen Harper, The Longer I'm Prime Minister, won the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize, the John W. Defoe Book Prize, and the Ottawa Book Award. Paul has won 3 Gold National Magazine Awards and a National Newspaper Award, and has filed stories from 17 countries around the world, so we are in good hands tonight. Let's give a warm welcome to our host, Paul Wells.
Thank you very much, Sean. And thanks to our guest, Jody Wilson Raybould. Jody, we're making a habit of this. The last time you had a book out, we did an interview in person for the Ottawa Writers' Festival. So we're glad to have you back.
Yeah, thanks for having me. We were in that big church last time, but this will
With a
have to
huge
do for
crowd.
now. Yeah.
Let's begin with the title and the subtitle of your book. My own experience is that authors spend a lot of time on both parts of the book. So what made you choose the title Indian in the Cabinet? And then the subtitle, I think I caught as I went through your book, but why Speaking Truth to Power?
Well, I mean, in terms of overall the title, the Indian in the Cabinet part at least, I had always had that title in the back of my mind on the off chance that I may ever write about my experience in government. And it was reinforced as I proceeded through the years while in government in terms of what Indian in the Cabinet means. It's called Indian in the Cabinet because I came into government. Of course, I'm a proud Indigenous person, came into government and sat around the cabinet table and realized for the most part that I was viewed as an Indian in all of that, what that word means in terms of our colonial legacy and the Indian Act. Speaking truth to power has a lot to do with the way that I have been raised in my culture from the West Coast, recognizing that one must use their words carefully and to speak the truth. And in my culture, Kwakwakiwak, we're an oral culture, and if we do not speak the truth, then our culture dies. So I think that there's a lot of things that can be taken from the lessons that and the teachings that I was raised with, and also the experiences that I had as an MP and certainly as minister in speaking truth to power in many different circumstances, including around SNC Lavalin.
Okay. That phrase comes up also in the first several days after you get sworn into cabinet. In one of your briefings, you and your colleagues are said that part of your job will require at some point speaking truth to power, which you took to mean being square with the prime minister, essentially. That becomes a running theme in the book because it turns out that that's maybe something that they liked more in theory than they ended up liking in practice.
Yeah, there was, I talk a lot about being sworn in and some of the very initial discussions that we had as a government that included many other individuals in those meetings. And when we came into government in 2015, there was a lot of conversations, both behind closed doors and in public, about cabinet or government by cabinet, about being open and transparent. In fact, documents were released that spoke to accountability and transparency, and we had public servants and people within the Prime Minister's office saying that we needed to play challenge functions as ministers and bring our expertise and our lived experience to the roles that we were in, and to continue to challenge in terms of the discussions that we would have over the next number of years. So in speaking, at some point you will have to speak truth to power was something that somebody said in one of those very early meetings, and I never knew or realized that wasn't something that I was supposed to take seriously.
So let's back up as the book does. Let's go back. In the interest of the time we have, not all the way to your childhood, although there's a shocking moment when apparently you're caught shoplifting hair elastics in from the Kmart as a kid.
Did that
actually,
shock you?
Actually, let's go back that far. What the heck was that about?
I don't know. It's an awful lesson for anybody that's watching, but my sister and I, we were in Campbell River, which is very close to where I grew up, and for some reason we had a rebellious streak and we went into Kmart, and I don't know if they have Kmarts in Ontario, but took hair elastics. I don't even know how much they cost, but we were put into a police car, taken to the police station. My father, who was a quite prominent Indigenous leader at the time, came down, and we were taught a lesson, and we went through a probation officer, and we were taken in to see a judge. I guess it was a little bit of mischief. I was a pretty mischievous child when I was younger. I probably dragged my sister into doing that. She was a better child than I was.
But by the time you get to Ottawa, you're so straight-laced that you actually disclose that in your cabinet.
Go
vetting
figure. Go figure. I obviously didn't have to, but out of an abundance of caution, I disclosed everything. I was looking for skeletons in the closet, but I straight-laced, as you said, couldn't find many of those, if any.
So that was the biggest skeleton you could find. There's an interesting passage where you sort of get recruited for federal politics by a new Liberal leader who you basically didn't know at all, and by a former Liberal leader who you knew a little better. You're not the first one. Your colleague Jane Philpott has also talked about how Paul Martin played a role in hunting up star candidates for Justin Trudeau in the days after 2013, 2014.
Yeah, I was the regional chief for the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations at the time, back in actually before that, probably around 2012 and after, and I had the great fortune of meeting Prime Minister Martin, and had invited him to come to an assembly that we were hosting on governance and education, and being such an advocate for First Nations education, Paul Martin agreed to come, and from there we formed a relationship, a supportive one, and he became somewhat of a mentor to me. I mean, I have a great deal of respect for Prime Minister Martin, but through that, I think there was a bit of a game of telephone, and Mr. Martin and perhaps some others sent messages to Justin Trudeau, and it was in the lead up to the 2015 election, and I happened to be, and I talk about this in the book, in Whitehorse at an Assembly of First Nations meeting, and Justin Trudeau, who was the then Liberal leader, came up to see the assembly, but it turns out, at least from my perspective, he came up to recruit me to sign up for the Liberal Party and to run in 2015, which I detail quite a lot in the book.
Surely you would have had colleagues in the Indigenous movement who would have said, don't even try it. You can't fix this system from within. It will just inevitably lead to compromise and disappointment. Did you hear that sort of thing at the time?
Well, there's and rightfully so, a great amount of distrust in the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the federal government, provincial governments. I mean, it's no secret in terms of the historical relationship and not seeing eye to eye, not implementing rights. So there's a general mistrust. I hope that that's improving. But I had colleagues that were on the national executive, the national chief at the time, encouraging me to run for national chief. His term was coming to an end, and a lot of people said, "Why would you go into, as some people call it, white politics or mainstream federal politics when we had and still do have a tremendous amount of work to do in the Indigenous worlds in terms of rebuilding governance and nation building?" So it was a really hard decision, and it was coming off my conversation with Justin Trudeau at the time was coming off quite a combative relationship with the then government under Stephen Harper, and there was a series of meetings that were held trying to advance the agenda around rights recognition and comprehensive land claims. And there was a general frustration. We were seeing protest movements, hunger strikes across the country. Idle No More was on the rise. But I was taught from a very young age, if you want to get something done, if you want to see change happen, in this case, in terms of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown and laws and policies that needed to change, that you have to get involved and you have to put your money where your mouth is. And I was very vocal at the time in condemning the approach or the lack of approach that was being taken by the previous government. So it was at that point, and it took me a number of months to decide to run, but I knew that to actually make the changes in the laws and policies, the best opportunity at that time was to get involved, hopefully be elected as an MP, and then contribute to how I could from within, while maintaining relationships, obviously, with Indigenous leaders and bringing forward the solutions that I knew existed and have existed for decades to solve the challenges that we have in terms of rebuilding within Canada.
So you decide to go in, you run, you win, everyone wins, big Liberal wave. And I get the impression you were quite surprised to be named Minister of Justice and Attorney General. I guess anyone who's just been elected for the first time would be, like a bunch of your colleagues would have been surprised. The only guy in the book who seems like he expected what he got coming was Stéphane Dion as foreign minister. And everyone else was a little bit overwhelmed.
Well, I mean, I for sure I was overwhelmed. There were many, as you know, MPs that were just elected that were put right into cabinet. I mean, I am completely grateful and honored to have been placed there, but and being in an environment where there was such great hope and optimism, there were so many promises that had been made and steps that were going to be taken by our government that just brought in so many people in terms of that feeling that things were going to change and that politics was going to be different. So, I mean, did I ever expect that I would be named Minister of Justice and the Attorney General? I had inkling, I got hints about a week before I was sworn in. I mean, in some places in my mind, I thought that being in cabinet was a possibility, not the portfolio that I was given. But I'm really grateful for it, and certainly was told by many that it was something that had been identified for me quite early on in terms of our approach to approaching the 2015 election and the identification of cabinet portfolios.
Now, being in 2015, being Minister of Justice and Attorney General means you're about to be swallowed up for about a year, legalizing marijuana and cannabis, and legalizing medical assistance in dying.
Yeah.
Both, I mean, huge challenges that were shared with several of your colleagues, and that you can't have, if you dreamed as a kid about being Canada's Minister of Justice, that can't have been what you dreamed of doing. How much of your time and effort did those files eat up for the first couple of years?
A significant amount. And I mean, when I was asked to be minister, one of the very first things that went through my head is, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to legislate medical assistance in dying. I mean, cannabis, yes. I mean, I was partnered with Ralph Goodall, with Jane Philpott, and then again, thankfully, partnered with Jane Philpott in terms of medical assistance in dying. But those two files were huge, and they took a ton of energy, time, not only ministerial time, but our political staff and departmental staff. So there was huge teams around us and supporting the in-depth consultations that we had. And, a lot of discussions happened between and among ministers and around the cabinet table, really important discussions. For me, and I talk about this a lot in the book, about my experience in legislating medical assistance in dying, arguably the most important, the most emotional, the most far-reaching file that I think, certainly me, but I think anybody could be involved in terms of going from, we were under a significant time clock from the Supreme Court of Canada, but medical assistance in dying is something that touches every person in some way or another. So it was an extreme roller coaster of emotions, a diversity of experience and perspectives from Canadians. So thankful that I had Minister Jane Philpott with me for this. And it's something that I, to this day, and it's been, the government, Parliament has seen fit to change the law, but it was legislation that I'm extremely proud of, and I'm extremely proud of it for many reasons, but in particular because of the wealth of information, perspectives we received, and how we were able to work across party lines as best we could, work with senators and find what I still believe was the best option for the country and provided the best balance. So for me, it was a huge amount of work, but it was the best preparatory work in terms of how Parliament can actually operate to put forward legislation that was trying to balance all the divergent views.
Now, almost all the commentary that I saw among my colleagues at the time was that first medical assistance in dying law didn't go nearly far enough. It didn't extend that right to nearly enough people, and that people who were living difficult end-of-life situations had no access to this option. And in fact, there was a court decision a couple of years later that tended to go in that direction. Why did you do it the way you did it, and would you do it differently if you with the benefit of hindsight?
I thought about this question, and of course I thought about it as a parliamentarian when the government brought forward amendments to legislation, further opening it up. I don't have regrets. I mean, we did a significant amount of work we all have personal perspectives that we bring to these issues, and I certainly had mine. But yeah, there was so many people that wanted us to go farther, and there was an equal number of people that said we were going too far in terms of balancing that personal autonomy with, protecting vulnerable people. So I think we got the balance right. I had long discussions. I talk in the book about a relationship that I had with an individual named Jennifer that eventually did access medical assistance in dying after suffering for many, many years with MS. And her going through processes about whether or not she would qualify. I also had a grandfather that had Alzheimer's for 15 years, and we've had conversations around our table about advanced directives. Now, advanced directives haven't been legislated. This is still an important conversation. But they're conversations that need to continue to happen. So what we did at the time, whether it be around advanced directives, people suffering from mental illness alone, or mature minors, is to seek more study. And that's what's happened. And I think we're continuing to learn as society and as Canadians get more used to the regime. We've seen some changes, and I suspect that there are going to be more changes as we continue to have these really important conversations.
Okay. Some people watching are saying, this is insane. Wells has gone 20 minutes into this thing and he hasn't said SNC Lavalin yet. So I will now begin the long process of getting to that.
Yeah.
But the reason I've asked about all this other stuff is, yours is the first book by a cabinet minister from this government. Yours is the first insight into how this government worked, both when it was working and when it was not working as well. And one of the things that strikes me is very early efforts by this government to make sure that the Prime Minister's office has a look into ministers' offices, and to make sure that you all were good Liberals who were working for the party's re-election as well as for the government. And from a pretty early on, you're not super fond of either of those initiatives.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously understand the nature of political parties, and I think, political parties are important in terms of bringing together people and advancing, common directions. But for me, I came into mainstream federal politics from Indigenous politics, and in the Indigenous politics, there are no political parties. So I was unaccustomed to how deeply entrenched political parties and partisanship is. And I talk a bit about this, when I became a minister, I was so engrossed in my mandate letter, which I joke is longer than I am tall, trying to get things done. And there were people in the Prime Minister's office within the Liberal Party, and I suspect this is in every political party, I'm not sure, but ministers were expected to, all MPs were expected to be members of, the Laureate Club, which is, making significant donations to the party. All of my ministerial political staff were expected to donate to the party, and were also expected to make calls in by-elections and to campaign for the party. And I didn't buy into this, and I had staff that would come up to me feeling very uncomfortable. I mean, I never hired them for their political allegiance. I hired them because they were extraordinarily smart and wanting to achieve the ends of our mandate letter. So it was surprising in that sense, and different ministers, different individuals respond in different ways. But for me, when I was Minister of the Crown, and certainly when I was an MP, I am not the most partisan of individuals. In fact, I'm not partisan at all. But in trying to get things done, I think there's too many walls that are built up in terms of us versus them, and our ideas are better than their ideas, and it just simply doesn't work to have the other when you're actually trying to make policy and laws that are fair policy and laws that impact all Canadians. To have an us versus them mentality is something that I learned is very entrenched, but very dangerous in my view to our democracy.
So you become Justice Minister Mojag, Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Yeah.
You get sent a chief of staff, and it doesn't work out. And eventually, quite some time later, you get your own choice to be chief of staff. But this is where we hit the first thing that I found really quite striking, which is that ministers are strongly discouraged from meeting among themselves unless their chiefs of staff, who in most cases are handpicked by the Prime Minister's office and very tight with the staff of the Prime Minister's office, are present. So unless you've got your escort, you shouldn't be talking to cabinet colleagues. And again, that's not something that you took very well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you, the best way to function as a cabinet, which includes the Prime Minister, is to have conversations. I mean, this is a small number of people who are responsible for extraordinarily impactful initiatives and mandate letters. So we should be able to talk between and amongst ourselves and have trust there. What I found, and this increased over time, or became more overt than it was initially, was the increasing centralization of control within the Prime Minister's office and control by unelected people within the Prime Minister's office. So yes, ministers were told that when you meet, you have to have your chief of staff there. I was encouraged not to, meet with ministers that became my friends. It was not uncommon, and I talk a bit about this in the book. It was not uncommon at the 11th hour to have somebody from the Prime Minister's office come in and say, we need to change this in terms of our approach to a particular maid or cannabis. And when you're spending day and long days and nights working on something and bringing in the evidence and all of the best efforts by your public servants and by stakeholders and beyond to contribute towards an approach on cannabis or medical assistance in dying, to have somewhat unwanted at the 11th hour whims of unelected people telling you what to do. It's very disconcerting, and certainly something that I always spoke up against, as did many other ministers.
There's a big chunk on a cabinet shuffle, and it wasn't even the one I was expecting. It's the shuffle before the one where you briefly changed functions before you left cabinet altogether. It's the shuffle in which, in 2018, where Indigenous service or Indigenous. I'm trying to think what the original name of that department in this government was. What used to be DIAN or INAC. By 2017, it was called
Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. Yeah.
Yeah, and then it was going to get split into Crown Indigenous Relations and Indigenous Services under Carolyn Bennett and, at the time, Jane Philpott. This was something you'd actually been discussing among colleagues. And there was, going back to the Royal Commission report from the 90s, it was something that had been mooted, but the conversations around doing that were not nearly to the point where you thought it was ready for that to happen. And then you get told it's about to happen. That must have been a strange moment.
Yeah, I mean, it was very, I was, to say the least, taken aback. I don't go into too much detail about the conversation, but I had been working with others, making plans about how we were going to follow through with what we promised on Indigenous issues, including the recognition of rights and creating the space for Indigenous nations to rebuild their governing structures, and how we can move away from having a Minister of Indian Affairs ministering over Indigenous peoples to actually creating the space for self-determination and self-government. part of that, and this is what we were having conversations about, and looking at the Royal Commission on that in Aboriginal peoples, some 30 plus years before then, was recommended that you bifurcate or split up the ministries into what we saw during that cabinet shuffle. And that's fine. And I was happy that it was being split. But yes, it was too fast. We hadn't done the necessary policy work. We hadn't made the necessary legislative changes, nor had we changed how the public service, the operational practices of government and how that would all roll out. So it was a bit, it was too fast in my mind. I mean, I was happy that it happened, but it just, for me, started my brain taking and thinking of all the different changes that we would have to make in order to make that symbolic bifurcation or split actually mean something. And, that was a sign of problems to come.
Because it was major. I mean, like a large part of the Department of Health Canada goes, ups and goes across town to become part of Indigenous services, and theoretically, Crown Indigenous relations would have been able to concentrate on major structural change, although not a lot of that has actually come to pass. But that was a major shuffle, and as one of the ministers who, I don't know, was advocating for it, and then it happens when you're not ready, when you're not ready for it. That's one of the big surprising moments in the book.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. And I, as I said, there were plans in place in terms of transitioning to actually making the necessary changes to laws and policies and the operating practices of government to put in place. So there would be a comprehensive approach to the changes that were necessary. Part of that, and I'm proud of this, was releasing principles as to how the relationship between the federal government and Indigenous peoples would unfold. There were 10 principles, I talk about that in the book, that are still hung in every Indigenous Services, Crown Indigenous Relations office in the country, about the nature of the relationship, that it's and the honor of the Crown, rights recognition, embracing self-determination. So there was a lot of efforts to show what we were doing, or to look like we were doing a lot, when the necessary work to actually create and back up those announcements hadn't been done. And we find ourselves in a place where the Minister of Crown Reconciliation, Carolyn Bennett, is still engaging in a manner that of negotiations, as opposed to having a framework to engage, a broad framework to engage Indigenous nations when they're wanting to become self-governed and when they're wanting to move beyond the Indian Act. That framework's not there.
The Prime Minister got up in the House of Commons in the spring of 2018 to announce that framework was on the way. Are we talking about the same thing? We're talking about the framework agreement.
We are.
And by the end of that year, and the Prime Minister does not often get up in the House of Commons to announce major policy directions from government. By the end of that year, he'd pulled it back. He had said, we're not going to go ahead with this for now. And there's been no substantive follow-up since then. What happened there?
Well, this is one of the promises that were made that simply weren't kept. And I would say, and I talk about this, I mean, that was the speech that the Prime Minister gave in the House of Commons on February the 14th of 2018. I was in the House listening to his words, and they were incredibly important to hear a Prime Minister stand up and say, we are going to do what was always intended in terms of Section 35 of the Constitution, and we're going to recognize rights, Indigenous treaty rights, Indigenous rights. We're going to move away from litigation. We're going to create the space for self-determination, self-government. These were words that Indigenous leaders and actions that Indigenous leaders have been asking for decades. Leading up to that speech, and I go into a bit about the back and forth in terms of the approach to Indigenous issues. I mean, I admit, I pushed really hard. I mean, I actually believed what we promised in our platform and early on in government, that we were going to deliver what we promised about no relationship being more important, and that ultimately, at the end of our tenure, we would have started the necessary process of creating the legal space for Indigenous nations. That led to a lot of differences of opinion, to say the least, some conflict between and among ministers, people telling me that I was moving too fast. And essentially, people telling me that they knew what was best, or that what they knew was right in terms of the approach to Indigenous issues. After February the 14th, pretty much everything fell away, and they were wonderful words in the House of Commons, important words to be on the public record. I so wish, and I wish to this day, and that the Prime Minister would follow through with the words that he spoke, because those words, in terms of rights recognition and creating a framework for Indigenous nations to be self-governing, is transformative, will be transformative for the country. And I am looking forward to the day when there is a leader that actually does that necessary work and creates that necessary space.
Say this government lasts another 3 years, this prime minister has the ministers that he wants in those portfolios. Do you think he's going to come back with that, or do you think that ship has sailed?
Well, I want to say I believe that they're going to do that. There is nothing reflected in their platform that leads me to believe that they are going to do that, or that they understand what that means. I'm not sure, just based on actions and what happened after February the 14th, that speech, if the Prime Minister and the government even understand what it means in terms of having and recognizing Indigenous people's rights. I, along with many other Indigenous leaders, I mean, we've known what the solutions are for generations. And I'm not sure that there is the necessary political will. There's been 6 years of a track record of not following through with the transformative change pieces that would actually give life to Aboriginal and treaty rights, which have been in the Constitution as long as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but have not been given the expression, nor the protection, nor the necessary changes in laws and policies to ensure that those rights are upheld, and that Indigenous peoples have the space within this country to rebuild their nations. I don't believe it's going to happen. I haven't seen it. If it does happen, I will be one of the first ones in line applauding and offering my assistance to get there, because it's so fundamentally important.
Now, already by this time in 2018, as a matter of fact, several months earlier, it's starting to look like your relationship with this prime minister, and especially with his staff, is heading downhill. Jerry Butt says, "Why are you always fighting us?" This is in 2017, when the two departments are split, or when the department is split into two. You are asked to show up at the cabinet shuffle, but you're forbidden from riding there with Jane Philpott. Why did things go downhill so quickly?
I think there's many reasons for the challenges in the relationship. I mean, that was just one minor thing that I put in the book about not being able to travel together, Jane and I, to Rideau Hall, and one can read in what they want about that, but certainly it was reflected to me that it wouldn't look well on Carolyn, who was getting shuffled or having part of her portfolio taken away from her. I mean, I think that as we moved on, to answer your question, as we moved on about why things became more difficult towards the election, governments, and I'm assuming this is with every government, they make decisions, they look at issues, what can be accomplished. Certainly the government that I was a part of made a lot of decisions based on polls and what they were hearing and what was popular and what needed to be done to garner the most votes. And I know this is true for all governments past. Indigenous issues are not necessarily issues that garner a lot of votes, although Indigenous people are starting to vote more, and that's important. It's not one of those topics, they're not one of those issues that people are debating. We just saw this in the election. Indigenous issues weren't top of mind. But for me, and it's not just Indigenous issues, justice issues, incredibly important in terms of supporting all people. How we as a society take care of vulnerable people determines how we are reflected and how we are viewed as a society. So we need to deal with these issues in a way that doesn't necessarily gain us vote. They're not politically expedient, I guess is what I'm trying to say, to address them. And they take a lot of work, and for many in the government, these were not the issues that would be tackled. And maybe the next mandate is a lot of what I was said.
And then SNC Lavalin happens. There's this majestic procession of people who come to you from various places, from the Prime Minister's office, from the Finance Minister's office, which I never understood, saying, look, we've changed the law so that companies don't have to go to trial. They can have, this simplifies things, but essentially a plea bargaining arrangement called the deferred prosecution arrangement. It's now legal. It's bright and shiny, and it's never been used before. Why don't you use it for SNC Lavalin, which is a pillar of the Quebec economy? And crucially, in your account, several of them say, and incidentally, there's elections coming in Quebec and federally, and this would really help the Liberal Party of Quebec and the Liberal Party of Canada. So why don't you do us a solid and get us that DPA? While all this was going on, what was going through your head?
Well, I mean, we started the process of, and it was led by other ministers, but because it was a change to the criminal code to enable remediation agreements, or the DPAs, into the criminal code as another tool for prosecutors, we started that quite some years before SNC sort of hit the fan. That was something that was being contended with for about a year and a half. Why didn't I succumb to the pressure? I mean, this was something that we very consciously as a cabinet put into and changed the criminal code, providing that additional tool for prosecutors. And as the Attorney General, I mean, the Attorney General is basically the head prosecutor of the country, but has a director of public prosecutions where they give a lot of their ability to prosecute to independently, as a fundamental tenet of our democracy is having and upholding the rule of law, but also having an independent judiciary, which includes having an independent prosecution, which I had enormous respect for. And we gave this tool to the prosecutor to make a determination based on the circumstances of a particular case, whether or not it would be appropriate to enter into deferred prosecution agreement. In this case, with respect to SNC, she did not deem it appropriate to do so, even though it was a legitimate tool in the criminal code that she could exercise. She provided me her view as to why she was not offering this to SNC, and I agreed with her and did not take any further action in that regard because she was the prosecutor, and I agreed with her opinion.
Okay, but then people start coming at you in waves and saying, could you reconsider? That was weird.
Yeah, and yeah, that was weird, and it started in late August of 2018 and continued through to and including conversations, the conversation that I had with the former clerk of the Privy Council in December. I knew very clearly, I mean, as Minister of Justice and Attorney General, I wear two hats, and I understand that both of those hats. As the Attorney General, I am removed from cabinet in the sense of taking into account political considerations, partisan considerations. As the Attorney General, they wear their judicial hat and not a political one. And that dividing line, I certainly was very clear about. I do not believe that even though I pressed on the importance of that distinction and how I cannot make decisions based on necessarily losing an election in Quebec. I mean, that's not a consideration that one makes in terms of deferred prosecution agreement or, never interfering in a prosecution. And some of my colleagues did not necessarily have that understanding.
None of the people that you named as having made that electoral argument to you, none of the people that you say told you, look, we got to do this because there's elections coming, ever testified at the Commons Committee that looked into SNC-Lavalin. They declined, citing essentially cabinet confidence. They declined to testify to the ethics commissioner. And you, in a long author's note at the end, you say there's a problem with that. There's a structural problem when these points are under dispute and we can't ask the people involved what their role was. And we were chatting earlier. You said that author's note was one of the hardest things to write in the book. What's the point that you're making in that note at the end?
Well, I mean, and I talk about this, I'm trying to articulate it in the author's note, but also like throughout the book, particularly towards the end of the book, around having reflections based on my experience in government and being able to share my experience, because I think it's important to shed light on some of the concerns and the realities about how governments actually function. And I go into talking about cabinet confidentiality and the principles around cabinet confidentiality. I mean, I understand the importance. I mean, we should have a place where cabinet can have debates and discussion and take into account issues and evidence and perspectives in a manner where they don't have to be fearful that they're going to be revealed. But what I do want to continue to have conversations about, and essentially put in the author's note, is that cabinet confidentiality or principles around that are not just necessarily like these obtuse legal constructs or realities, but they function on a day-to-day basis depending on issues that arise, and we need to have those principles of cabinet confidentiality. We all take oaths as ministers and privy councillors. We want those principles and conventions to promote good governance. We do not want to be able to misuse cabinet confidentiality because we do not want to reveal to the public something that we think might cast a shadow on the government, or to be able to, in the worst case scenario, to hide wrongdoing. There is a balance, in my view, that needs to be drawn from the necessary importance of cabinet confidentiality, but also not enabling governments who are acting badly to cover that up. That we need to be able to have a renewed conversation about good governance, about how we can ethically function in terms of our government, in terms of our democracy, and how we make sound decisions as ministers, as a government, and beyond. And it's not necessarily a place where we simply hide behind the shield of cabinet confidentiality. In this case, we're talking about SNC. A lot of people were, the ethics commissioner talks about this, were not interviewed. There's information that remains not revealed. I do not believe I believe that it is important to share that information to get to the bottom of these issues, to have full investigative powers, and that is not necessarily the case right now.
Have you ever discussed any of this stuff, either the specifics or the principles, with David Lametti since he became Attorney General?
No, I haven't had any conversations with David Lametti. I mean, I did have a very brief conversation with him as we were going in to be sworn in, or he was going to be sworn in as Minister of Justice and Attorney General. I mean, I did, after that, relay some of my views when I still had an audience with the Prime Minister around the role of Minister of Justice and the Attorney General, whether they should be separated, and expressing the clear need, and this changed when David Lametti was sworn in, the clear need for ministers to understand the distinction between those two roles, and changed in terms of an additional oath that the Attorney General takes, which I think is positive. But I think these conversations need to continue to happen, or to happen at all, I should say. I'm not sure how many of my former colleagues have thought about or reflected on the reality about cabinet confidence, what happened in the SNC-Lavalin affair. And I talk a bit about this in the book. And this happened, it became very public through a newspaper, and then it snowballed. But how many times, if we think about it, does something similar happen within government, within the inner sanctum of government, where there potentially could be wrongdoing going on and we never know about it? This, for me, was certainly a wake-up call. It's why, of a great degree, why I wrote about it, and I took great strains to articulate it, obviously in a more clear way than I'm doing it right now in the author's note. But these are, I think, really important conversations to have, and that Canadians be aware of in terms of the reality of governing.
See, I mentioned David Lametti, who's a guy I don't know, and who I like every Canadian, I wish him the best as Attorney General. It's a difficult job, and because of an irony that I can't shake, even like 2.5 years later, which is, you agreed with the public prosecutor that there would be no special deal, deferred prosecution agreement for SNC-Lavalin. And the Prime Minister's office sent the Olympic boot stomping team to walk all over you to try and get you to change your mind. He made the same decision, and nobody has said boo. What do you think that says about that, about the, I don't know, relative perceptions of the two attorneys general, about the rightness or wrongness of your original decision? What conclusions are we to draw by that?
Well, I would never put myself in the place of David Lametti when he became the Attorney General, nor would I impart my views to him. I mean, those are his decisions to make. For me, when this all came out, it was incredibly difficult. But behind closed doors for those 4 months, the pressure that was exerted on me, I'm not sure it would have been the same if it was somebody else, David Lametti, for example. I mean, I talk a lot about elements, the reality of racism and misogyny that exists around, for me, the cabinet table. I mean, that's real, and that's another reason why I wanted to write about my experiences and how I was treated around that table and beyond. But I'm not sure. I mean, it has something to do also with the nature of partisan politics and being part of, and I don't like to use these words in terms of politics, being part of a team. I don't view doing my job as a minister or politics as being part of a team, in the sense that you do what you're told to do, or that the goal is this and nothing else. I mean, I am a fiercely loyal person and believe in working with others. But for me, being part of a team and didn't mean and could never mean, and I would never compromise my principles and integrity to, in this case, if we're talking about SNC, to so-called secure jobs. No jobs were lost in Quebec, or to ensure that we don't lose votes in Quebec, or lose an election in Quebec, or a key firm moves from Quebec who can't operate that way. I would do the same thing again if we do not uphold the rule of law and ensure that fundamental tenets of our democracy are intact. Then we will see ourselves moving very quickly to look like other countries in the world. And for me, I know that I did the right thing, and maybe it's just lessons about the toxic realities of partisanship, and what can start to snowball very quickly if we aren't mindful of their impacts on our democracy and our institutions of government.
On that note, I think we're going to have to end this conversation. You've been really generous with your time. I touched on several different aspects of the book because I wanted people listening to us to get the sense that this book, Indian in the Cabinet, is a rich book that talks about a lot of different issues, about growing up in the 70s in the Indigenous milieu in British Columbia, about Indigenous politics as such before you became a federal politician, and about all the good times and the bad as a federal minister. Thanks for sharing all of that with us. I really appreciate it. Jody Wilson Raybould, who spoke to us today from Vancouver.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody.
The book's called Indian in the Cabinet, Speaking Truth to Power. The author is Jody Wilson Raybould. You cannot get into a bookstore in Canada and make your way to the cash register without finding a couple copies of the book, so you could be sure to go and take a look for it. My name is Paul Wells from Maclean's Magazine, speaking to you tonight from the Ottawa Writers Festival. Thanks very much for joining us. Good night.